This is Joe Barhoum, and let's talk about decision makers. First of all, who are they? Well, as the title implies, they are people who make decisions. Now, in a business context, specifically when it comes to selling, the decision maker is certainly critical to your cycle, but they are a little more difficult to reach than a decision influencer or a decision contributor. And we'll talk about what those mean in a second. The decision maker not only makes the decision, but they make the decision based on the information that they have. The influence and the context comes from the people they surround themselves with. These can be employees, contractors, consultants, friends, people who they don't have direct access to themselves, but people who are perhaps champions in certain areas of business that they follow on LinkedIn, for example, or in other areas. A lot of executives and decision makers have coaches that they work with. They could be mentors more formally, and they all help them make decisions. Where you come in as a sales professional is that you are trying to qualify your deal, budget, buying method, buying authority, that's decision maker, decision influencer, decision contributor, buying need, the timing of the buy, the timing of when value needs to be felt or observed, and of course, learning any risk to your cycle. The salesperson has to work with decision influencers and contributors in order to extract those elements, which we call beam manter: budget, method, authority, need, timing, and risk. However, those influencers and contributors the sales professional works with is actually relaying information from the salesperson and their team back to the decision maker or makers. Sometimes the decision maker is not an individual person. It may be a body or a board. And it's reasonable to think that even in a board situation or a body, that there's ultimately one person who takes a leadership role in making the decision. So what you have here, if you unravel what I just said, is a hierarchical structure of authority that the salesperson needs to find a way to navigate. In a long sales cycle where you're not selling a commodity, it is a little more difficult to reach the decision maker. And the reason I hesitate and say little is that it may very well depend on your level of access, which we haven't contextualized. It may also depend on what you're selling, which we haven't contextualized. If you're selling something that is extremely important to the decision maker or decision makers, you're more likely to reach them. Okay, so where do you find decision makers? Decision makers, if you haven't met them yet, are an assumption. You have to assume, based on your experience as a sales professional selling that particular product or service, or your many years in experience in a certain industry, that a particular profile exists. And that profile is the person who makes the decision, or the people who make the decision. So for example, if you're selling back office enterprise software, let's say it's an ERP system, this ERP system, which has direct access to multiple departments, it's the whole back end of an organization, from operations to finance, potentially human resources and payroll. This type of software likely gets all the way up to the CEO and to the board, because it's something that's done once a decade, on average. And it could be very expensive relative to the bottom line of the organization. On the other hand, if you're selling cell phones on behalf of a carrier or a manufacturer, sure, this could be expensive. Sure, this could be influential in terms of how many people it affects, could affect everybody in the organization or the top 20% of highest paid employees, what have you, but it's a phone. So, and it's generally going to cycle out every 2 years. Your employees will have access to a new line of phones, and there's a lot of competition in this space. And so generally this would not be considered something that the CEO has to approve. It just depends on the amount of transformation required by the organization in order to acquire the product, whether that's a financial transformation, operational transformation. There are many different types of transformations that may need to exist in order for the organization to adopt the technology or the product or the service, at which point it would then go to the CEO or a COO or some other executive or a board for final approval. So the question is, what do you want the decision maker to hear? Because generally in the context of a long sales cycle, selling a non-commodity that's highly important, or even something that's not as important as an ERP system, let's say, but still influential, that needs a decision maker to approve at a high level, someone you won't have direct access to early on as a salesperson. As I mentioned earlier, you need to tell your influencers and contributors of the decision what you want the CEO or decision maker to hear. So if you think about that, go back to BMANTR: budget, method, authority, need, timing, and risk. Risk is an observation that you make, so we'll put that to the side. So as far as the other components go, how can you qualify your deal, continue to move the meeting forward along the sales cycle, continue to move the buyer forward in their buying cycle while being very observant about what it is that, where it is they are in their buying cycle? What do you want to say to the influencers and contributors that you feel confident would go back to the CEO or decision maker? So things around budget. You don't want to blow out their budget by throwing out a number that hasn't been vetted by the influencers and contributors. To a very big degree, when we talk about what an influencer is, an influencer certainly is going to help the decision maker make a decision. They may have been formally tasked with that decision, right? Say, go out and find us a new ERP system. Go out and find us new laptops. Go out and find us a new voice over IP solution. They may have been told to go do this by the decision maker or a body, and so when they come back, it's a little more formal, right? They are intentionally coming back to fulfill the requirement of their position at this time by doing their investigation, watching demos, being in sales meetings with you and your competition, and then going back to the person who asked them to do this. However, the influencer also has something personal that they're trying to get from this. You know, if they don't do a good job, if they don't recommend a good solution to the decision maker, they could lose their job. That's why some organizations invest so heavily in their brand cachet and their reputation, because they know that when put up against competition, even if it's a young, up-and-coming, fancy competitor, they won't lose, because they know that the decision influencers will always recommend or often recommend them, because they won't lose their job for recommending such a well-known, well-received organization. So take, for example, laptop manufacturing. If a company like Razer, who makes gaming laptops, if they were to stack AMD processors or Exynos processors in their gaming laptops, and then that doesn't work out, they may lose their jobs. And they probably very well likely would lose their job if Razer lost market share as a result of consumers being apprehensive or unsatisfied with non-Intel processors. So in this case, Intel is the large organization with the cachet, with the great reputation that comes in, and generally every gaming laptop uses Intel. So that's just a quick lesson on decision influencers, decision makers. Let's move on and talk a little more about how you get in the meeting. This is very difficult. There's no silver bullet answer to how you get a meeting with the decision maker. The key is there has to be a compelling reason. So put yourself in the shoes of a decision maker, and let's again focus on those situations where the decision maker is somebody at an executive level. These people, again, put yourself in their shoes, are likely making a lot of decisions often, and those decisions can lead to tremendous changes within their organization. So if you're going to get a meeting with them, it has to be for a compelling reason. A compelling reason is not, I just want to buy you a cup of coffee, which is very transparent, that you really just want to get a meeting with them because you are hoping that they may like you well enough and like what you do well enough to move forward in a sales cycle, right? Or in their case, a buying cycle. A compelling reason may be something that takes external factors that the decision maker has no control over. So major impact to the economy, a pandemic, or a housing crisis that led to every industry in the United States, around the world, taking an economic dip, a recession because of this. Okay, that's a compelling event. How does it impact their business? How can you be the linchpin between the impact from these external factors and survival within their organization? And when I say survival, I do mean it that way, but you probably want to be a little more specific. in terms of you replace survival with a specific type of benefit from them meeting with you and engaging with you. That's how you can compel them to meet with you. Now, it doesn't mean you're always going to get the appointment. So you have to create desire and use stewed when you're talking to people that surround the decision maker to eventually get the meeting that you want. There are two approaches that are common from a sales perspective to penetrate an account and what we call gain access, which is step 3 in the selling cycle. Step 1 is to profile. Who are my best types of customers? Step 2 is to prospect. You're going to directly reach out to those types of people. And then step 3 is to gain access. This means that you now have the attention and a formal meeting. Well, it doesn't have to be super formal, but a phone call or a face-to-face meeting or a virtual meeting with someone within the organization who has access to a decision maker, if not the decision maker themselves, right? So we're gaining access. Using stewed to gain access is through people of influence and contributors. That's a bottom-up approach. We talk to people who surround the decision maker so that we can work our way up and get access to the decision maker. The sales cycle doesn't exactly start over once you finally reach a decision maker. So for example, if the decision maker is the CEO and you've been speaking with operations managers, the controller, then the assistant controller, and then you get some groundswell of information, you're going cross-departmental, people are trying to talk about you and your service, and then you get access to a CFO and a COO, and then they come together and say, yep, let's go meet with the CEO so we can finalize this thing. You've now gained access to the decision maker, but that doesn't mean your sales cycle starts over. What you have are two concurrent sales cycles. Going back to the previous slide and the things that I said in the beginning, you now have to requalify your deal to validate that it's still a good buyer, and you'll be able to service and execute, but also that the CEO understands what he or she would be signing off on. And that is 100% critical. I've seen a lot of deals, and I've been a part of them myself, both as a buyer and a seller, where the CEO or the buying entity did not understand, the decision-making entity, I should say, do not understand what they're buying. It doesn't mean that they're completely off base, and so it could be so minor, just a minor misinterpretation, and that's the reason they say no, or the reason they say yes, and then 3 months down the line, they're going, wait a minute, this isn't what I bought, even though everyone else was on board below them. The other option is to go top down. This would be calling the decision maker first, or at least one level away from the decision maker. This is a very dangerous and risky approach. It doesn't work out very often for young sellers, even for mature sellers, people with a lot of experience. Going back to what I said about brands that are trusted, brands with cachet, I could be the CEO or the CRO of a processor manufacturing company, designer manufacturer. But if I'm not Intel, let's say I maybe only have 100 employees and I only have 2 factories, I'm not Intel. I'm not getting a meeting with the CEO of Razer so I can try to convince him to put my processors in his laptops, right? But if I'm the CEO of Intel, I certainly could go CEO to CEO in that matter because I'm much bigger and more important to Razer than, Joe's processor company. So just be very cautious. If you want to go top down, you could be, I wouldn't say, you wouldn't get blacklisted necessarily, but you're not going to set a good tone. That's why it makes sense to go bottom up, gather information, put in the work, and then go after the decision maker. So now, finally, just a quick recap on this. Something that I think is important for young sellers to know, and sometimes even mature sellers need to be reminded of this, is that most people are reasonable. I can't tell you how many times I was pleasantly surprised. I could be very nervous by a title, right? Someone's a CEO. That would freak me out. What a title. Someone's a CFO. What a title. And they turn out to be perfectly pleasant, amazing people. And I think that's a very important thing to remember. Don't feel like you have to talk up. Don't feel like you have to be intimidated. Try to just put some objectivity in place, rattle yourself, and say, you know what? People are just people. And there's another thing that I think is critical. I had a really good salesperson teach me this when I was younger. She said she always tries to be professionally persistent and persistently professional. And this is specifically when it comes to that bottom-up approach. If you're going to be persistent in gaining access into an account, it's not as easy as one phone call or one email or one LinkedIn post with the right hashtag. It's going to take a tremendous amount of effort. A lot of organizations, professional research institutions, when they research sales and gaining access, a lot of what I hear often from them or read often is that it takes between 8 to 12 touches in order to get a response from a prospect. And that could be across all dimensions within the organization, so from the janitor up to the CEO. And touches can be defined as phone calls, voicemails, emails, direct messages over LinkedIn, if you're persistent enough or bold enough, a DM through Facebook, different ways to get their attention, right? To throw out, this is who I am, this is who I work for. It takes 8 to 12 of those to finally get someone to reply to you. And those replies are not always in the affirmative. Sometimes it's very negative. This is something important to keep in mind. It can be difficult to do. We don't want to pick up the phone for the 7th time. We don't want to pick up the phone for the 8th time. I can't tell you how many times when I was a young seller, we would have these exercises where we would try to make 8 calls before 8 a.m. or we'd place 5 calls after 5 p.m. And we would do these competitions to see who we could reach. And it's just that 8th phone call. Like, you know what? I was going to go home at 5 o'clock, but I figured I'll pick it up if I'll call that person for the 8th time, and then bam, you get their attention. And the next thing you know, 6 months later, you close a nice software deal. I have seen this happen many times. And keep in mind also that decision makers have, it's not incredibly binary, but effectively they're going to say yes or no, right? Assuming they understand precisely what it is they're buying, or you know they understand what it is that they're buying, and it can be very narrow, their understanding. It's the influencers that are tough ones, because what they're trying to do is say, look, I'm going to go off and buy new processors for all of our laptops. We're going to manufacture 3 million laptops. I've got to find the right processor for this one particular model. They have to talk to a lot of different processor manufacturers. Or if they're doing a construction project, they have to talk to a lot of companies that provide equipment, whether it's the giant earth-moving tractors or it's just drills. They have to talk to a lot of manufacturers to make sure they vet and get the right one, so then when they make the recommendation to the decision maker, it goes by smoothly. So remember, they're going to be the ones with the wall up, in the conversation, and they're going to be difficult to access because you have a lot of competition going after them. Presumably, once the influencer has actually said, okay, I like what you have to offer, terms look great, I'm going to go ask the CEO for approval or whomever the decision maker is, at that point, you should be good to go. So that's the hard layer within this that you really need to build great relationships with and make sure they understand what it is that you're trying to sell them and that you know what their needs are. And then lastly, something to keep in mind, back to the bottom-up approach as we recap this, is that the people who influence the influencers, right? The people who are feeling the pain of whatever it is that's causing the need that they have, they're the easiest to reach. They're the ones, so for example, if we go back to human resources software, so a software package to help manage all of the people within the organization from benefits to payroll, time management, etc. This is software that is managed generally by people in the HR department and to some degree IT. So these folks are feeling the pain of a bad system. So one symptom of a bad system is we have to enter the same data in more than one place. We have a recruiting module. We have people submit their resumes and fill out a form with their name and address, for example. And then if we decide to onboard them, we have to retype all this information. So, okay, there's a time suck there, but also there's opportunity for errors. So if you find out that there have been errors, you're only really going to know that if it's a small amount of errors, but still notable, from the people who do the data entry. And that's not a decision influencer, it's not a decision maker in this type of scenario. It's going to be somebody at a lower level. So I hope you found this lesson valuable on decision makers. If you have questions, do reach out, and I'll be sure to post some more of these lectures coming soon. Thank you.